where we're now talking about the blood. And one of the things that we've looked at so far for this chapter is the structure of these fragments and these cells and these components of the blood. And one of the things that I mentioned is that the white blood cells are going to keep their nuclei and organelles, but the red blood cells are not. And so we left off talking about how these cells are produced. We looked at having the stem cell, that giving rise to colonies, which are going to give rise to the different cells. So as we look at the cells, which is, where part 2 is going to pick up. Part 2 is picking up on talking about our red blood cells, also known as our erythrocytes. Okay? So if you hear something eryth, all right, make sure to let that make you think about a red blood cell. When we look at their structure, they're going to have a really cool structure, I think, but their principal functions: pick up oxygen, deliver it to the tissues. Do that. That is what we want the red blood cells to do. Now, pick up the CO2. Yes and no, okay? Even though when we think about what happens in the body and when oxygen gets used, first of all, let's just think back real quick. How does a cell use oxygen?
It uses it to create ATP. We
use it to make ATP. And in what organelle can that occur?
Mitochondria.
My mitochondria. Now, why did I say can? Is there any other way that we can make ATP?
Yes.
How?
Anaerobic.
Anaerobic, which takes place where in the cell?
Is it the cytoplasm?
The cytoplasm. In the process of glycolysis, meaning glucose, which I keep trying to point out is the simplest sugar that our cells can use, and it's the most important, okay, because it is the only thing, only molecule that can go through glycolysis, i.e. the term glycolysis, glucose, okay? But when we make ATP in the mitochondria, it will use either that product from glycolysis based upon the glucose molecule, or it can use other materials. For example, it can use a fat cell. It can use a fat, okay? It can use a protein, all right? The only thing that can be in glycolysis is glucose. Now, there's a reason I'm kind of focusing on this. When we tend to think of making energy for the cell, those ATPs, we tend to think of it in the mitochondria and aerobically, okay, meaning getting a bunch of them. But do our cells need to get energy sometimes without going through the mitochondria?
Yes.
Yes. When?
Short burst of movement.
Short burst of movement. So it's very important that that glucose molecule is available for making energy. Once we get to the mitochondria, other products can be used. So our red blood cell, and even though other products can be used, the most efficient is the glucose molecule that gets to go through glycolysis and enter the mitochondria. So our red blood cell take oxygen to these tissues, which contain the cells, which can use that oxygen. Now, the picking up of CO2. The picking up of CO2 is a little more complex. CO2 can be picked up by a red blood cell. It's carried on a different part of the hemoglobin, which we'll talk about. The other part about this picking up of the CO2, if you remember, in making our ATP, okay, in making ATP, CO2 is the waste product. This is what we have to get rid of because CO2 is toxic to our bodies. So in the red blood cell, when we have a mature red blood cell, all of their organelles have been spit out. They have made, now remember, from the time that the red blood cell gets produced until the time it's mature, roughly 5 to 7 days, okay? In that time frame, the only thing that it's doing is making hemoglobin, because that's what the DNA in the nucleus of the red blood cell wants to code for. Okay, is everybody following me? So, once that red blood cell is mature and it spits out all of those organelles, that gives in this area, in this space of the red blood cell, a huge area to have, trust me, lots of hemoglobin molecules. Because we want it to have a bunch of hemoglobin so that we can carry a bunch of oxygen. Okay? Well, once we transport that oxygen to the cell and the cell uses it, the byproducts are toxic. If we get a byproduct from simply glycolysis, that short burst of energy, okay? For example, starting to run, like if you're a runner, okay, and you're going out for your daily job, the first thing that happens is making energy by glycolysis. The byproduct of that is a huge molecule called lactic acid that stays behind in the muscle and makes the muscle sore. But then we move into using oxygen. Now, if we go into the mitochondria and make all those 36, y'all remember the 32 to 36 ATPs that get made? Okay. Now, if that occurs, the product that gets wasted is the CO2. CO2 we need to breathe out. How do we get rid of the lactic acid if we only use glycolysis? Does anybody remember? After you do a strenuous exercise, if you can't afford it, go get a massage. Right? Now, if you can't, okay, drink plenty of water, because that will help you to get it, get the blood flowing, get it pushed to the liver and the kidneys so it can get rid of it. through your waste, okay, your urine. Now, CO2, there's a couple of things that's going to happen, okay? Now, if we think about a blood vessel, okay, and we think about these red blood cells that are traveling in the blood, do they get to leave the blood vessel?
Say that again.
All right? When we think about blood traveling through our bodies, when we think about blood traveling through our bodies, when the heart's missing, but that's okay. All right. The heart pumps, goes into my arteries, this great aorta, all right, branches to move up so that I get blood flow into the head and the upper extremities. Then it arches and begins to descend so that I feed everything below the level of the heart, okay? But here's the kicker. When people think about blood flow, these huge vessels are what people think about, right? Because you may hear, well, they had to go in through the femoral artery or the brachial artery, okay? Or they had to go see a vascular surgeon. Okay, is everybody with me? As the blood moves, and we have these big vessels that we think about, as they continue to branch, they go from being, now this is the arteries, they go from being extremely large to very small, microscopic, at the point where they become capillaries. Now, does any exchange of materials happen at this large structure? No. Where does exchange occur? At the capillaries. Why? Because if we think about having a tissue in the body, which we've talked about many times, okay, if this is my tissue, if I'm looking at a tissue has cells. At this tissue level is where I'm going to find a capillary bed, where one side is fed by an artery and the other one a vein. Is everybody following me? We're getting really ahead of ourselves, but this is okay, all right? We'll remember this for the next chapter. Now, blood flowing to the tissue is by way of an artery. At this level right here, the capillary bed, my vessel is only one cell layer thick. So at that capillary bed, where it's fed by an artery, has a vein, at this point is where all the exchange can occur, because it's a single cell layer thick, and that's the point that we can have the exchange, meaning dropping off of nutrients, picking up of waste.